Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hey everyone, good afternoon. It's Susan Kaufman. I'm here for Attitude Magazine's weekly ADHD Experts broadcast. Today we have a wonderful guest, Dr. Varleisha Gibbs, who will be talking about mindfulness and self-regulation for children with attention deficit disorder. She'll be guiding us through some simple techniques, mindful ADHD meditation, sense-soothing techniques to help improve focus and help manage emotions. Talking about topics such as why kids with ADHD have such trouble regulating their emotions, how reflexes connect to social skills and behavior, how to build and enhance self-regulation with ADHD meditation, mindfulness exercises designed to calm and center an unsettled child. So let me introduce Varleisha Gibbs to you. She is an associate professor, international lecturer, researcher, and the author of Self-Regulation and Mindfulness. She began her career in psychology at the University of Delaware and continued in the field of occupational therapy. She received both a master's degree from Columbia University, a doctorate from Thomas Jefferson University, and a Ph.D. in health sciences leadership at Seton Hall University. So we are honored to have you here today, Dr. Gibbs. I want to thank you so much for your time. The topic you're discussing is of great importance to our listeners. I also want to thank the sponsor of today's webinar, Play Attention. We are always grateful to our sponsors. Play Attention is the leading neurocognitive training program. It is designed to strengthen executive function and self-regulation. It enhances brain health, performance, and mindfulness. It's a comprehensive play attention system. It includes a NASA-inspired technology, mindfulness training, cognitive training, behavior shaping, and much more. Frankly, it's a very comprehensive program. To learn more about it, call 800-1-800-788-6786. or click playattention.com. Play Attention offers a free professional consultation and ADHD assessment. You can find the direct link for that on your screen under the sponsor tab. Again, playattention.com for a free professional consultation on their system. As always with our broadcast, Dr. Gibbs will present her slides and then she'll take as many questions as time permits. Before she starts her presentation, we wanted to ask you just what your primary reason for attending today is. Are you a caregiver of a child with ADHD? Are you a teacher who wants to use mindfulness in the classroom? Are you a professional who wants to use mindfulness with your clients, or another reason for being here? While you're taking the poll, let me just take you through the webinar console that you have on your screen. You can enter your questions in the Ask a Question section of the screen now or at any time as they occur to you. Download the slides right now if you'd like to follow along. Sometimes people like to print them out in the Download the Webinar slides in the Event Resources section. If you want to learn more about Play Attention, click the tab above the slides, or more about Dr. Gibbs, click the tab above the slides. And again, there's a direct link there to the free professional consultation for Play Attention. Key issue here is audio. If you have any audio problems, they're probably caused by a slow internet connection or an incompatible browser. We recommend using Chrome. And if you can possibly use a wired internet connection, you will have many fewer problems. Don't forget to close any other outstanding programs or tabs you might have open and try refreshing your page. With that in mind, I hope you have no audio problems, and I will turn this over now to Professor Gibbs, Dr. Gibbs, to start her presentation.
Thank you, Susan. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay. And, if you can't, let us know. I am going to just give a disclaimer that this is, overview. This is a short presentation, which I think is great to be able to introduce you all, perhaps to some of these concepts. I do thank you for joining me, hopefully on your lunch break. It's my lunch break as well. And I'm glad to see many of you answering the poll. I see we have a lot of caregivers here that are caring for children that have ADHD. I guess their second highest group will be professionals who want to use mindfulness, as well as our teachers and others. So, thank you you all for joining. And I will try to tailor our conversation to really meet a variety of needs. I'm often asked which age group I cover, and I try to really direct it based upon my audience or who I'm speaking for, but it's really the lifespan. We all have a need to self-regulate. We all can utilize mindfulness practices. And I think from this workshop, you'll see that this webinar, you will see that how I define mindfulness and mindful practices may be slightly different, than what you're looking for in terms of meditation and yoga, even though I mentioned those, but we'll get into it in just a bit. So I want to start with my primary background as an occupational therapist is really neuroscience, neuroanatomy. Those are the courses that I focused on as a professor. My platform. And so I do want to start with that because it is important to understand that we are sensory beings, and how we're sensory beings is really through our neurological connection. That connection is how we connect with the world, and it really makes us unique as humans. And so we all have sensory systems. And in order for us to function in everyday life, we have to go through different processes that are neurochemical, electrochemical reactions. And so I want to give you one of my little phrases. It's first you have a feeling, then you have an emotion, and last you have a response. And so if you think about the process of us interacting with our environment and bringing in information to our bodies, it really has to travel along nervous system, your spinal cord, your cranial nerves, in order to then get to your brainstem area. If you look at the image here, you'll see that there is this little image at the bottom of the brain. It looks a little bit like a tail. That is your brainstem. It's really a gateway, a passageway to your cortical structures, the big parts of your brain. And so if you travel along that brainstem, that will be the first trigger of your arousal level, how much you're attending to your environment. It's also in charge of vital functions, eating, sleeping. Many of our children have challenges with sleeping. Many of them have challenges with their diet, et cetera. So that is really where it all starts. And so that's why it's so important when we talk about arousal and attention, self-regulation, we find ways to reach that, what I call foundational level. That foundational level of that brainstem. And so it sounds very complicated, but it can be very basic. Think about the basic needs that a baby would need: touch, food, hydration. And I'll get into that in my chart that I will provide at the end in terms of how can we target that basic brainstem function. So as information travels through, it then will get to the center, the deep structures of the brain. And those deep structures of the brain are really important for your emotions. And so first you feel in your body, next you have an emotion. And that emotional brain or limbic is also the structure involved not just in your in memory and in learning. So you can imagine if your brainstem allows a lot of information to come in at once, it doesn't do a good job at filtering out as it should, that your emotions will then have an influx, if you will, of information and not exactly sure what to do with it. Those same structures that you need for attention and learning are now preoccupied. And so our goal ultimately is to get to the top part of our brain so that we can make sense of all of this information to then send down a response to the structures of our body. Unfortunately, in that process of being preoccupied, we don't really give the front part of our brain a chance to respond. And so oftentimes, instead of a response, we have what we call a reaction. So a lot of our children and adults, if you will, that are really being challenged by conditions such as ADHD, we will often see a reaction that doesn't really involve the cortical structures. So, I'd like to remove the phrase, "What were you thinking?" I'm a parent. I have now a soon-to-be teenager and an 8-year-old that's soon-to-be 9, and I understand. Sometimes those phrases come out, and it may not be the best moments. However, try our best to remove that. If you're dealing with a spouse, for instance, that has ADHD as well, it could be pretty challenging for that relationship. be careful and mindful, if you will, about saying, what were you thinking? Because sometimes it's not an intentional response. It's more of a reaction. So first you have a feeling, then you have an emotion. Hopefully you will have a response, but unfortunately, oftentimes we'll see this reaction come into play. So I want to get into the slide a little bit. Number one you see here is that we have more than 5 senses. So I want you to think about what are your sensory, what's your sensory system comprised of? What senses do you have? And I'm sure you'll automatically think about vision, sight, taste, touch, sound. However, there are a lot more. So when I say that our brainstem has an influx of information coming in from the environment, it's probably way more than you could imagine. And I'm going to introduce you to a few other senses that we all have to be able to integrate to be able to function. So if you do have a neurochemical imbalance, such as ADHD, then that influx is going to be compromised. Number two, our prefrontal cortex is not fully developed in childhood. So that frontal lobe, the very tip of the front part of your brain, we call it the leader or the executive. It's in charge of executive functioning, which consists of problem solving, making best choices, inhibition, being able to stop yourself from doing something that may not be the best choice. All those things are what we would call executive functioning, part of cognition, brain processes. And when you think about it, as we develop, our motor system develops very early on in life. You can feel a baby move even when within the mom's womb. Emotions start very early on in life. You can see babies self-soothing on an ultrasound by sucking their thumb. So all those things happen pretty early on. Our emotional brain is highly wired, very in tune. And then we have this last part of our brain developing, not in utero, not fully developed in childhood, but right around the age of 20-25 is when we really see that prefrontal cortex fully intact, if you will. And I'm giving a pretty blanket statement, trying to really summarize this for us. That part of your brain happens later on in life. So our expectations for children to sit and attend, listen, and then problem solve at the age of 3 or 4, 6 or 7 even is challenged without giving the body what it needs. And I'll get into that further. Number 3 is context and environment matters. So if I just told you that we take in a ton of information through all these sensory systems at once, then of course it's going to matter what's around us, who's around us, what's being said, what are we smelling, what are we seeing. I often give a scenario of sometimes for me going into a child's birthday facility, there's several different ones around where, children gather for birthday parties. There's climbing apparatuses, there's games, there's pizza, there's cake, there's chips being smushed into the carpet. There's all types of things going on. I am usually a pretty even keel person. Even I get overwhelmed in those situations. So having a conversation with someone about something that may be kind of technical, even something I think I know pretty well, which would be the brain, I would be challenged in that moment to access those brain structures because my body, my self-regulation is now compromised by what's around me. So setting up the environment is going to be key. And number 4, there is a mind-body connection. So I think we're all starting to catch on to this a little bit more. I am very much so into meditation. I do it every day. I do it multiple times a day, yoga, etc. However, not just on that level, but a neurological level, we actually have a pathway that is connecting our mind and our body. When you hear ADHD, we often talk about neurotransmitters, dopamine, serotonin. So there's a few that you may hear of that medication may target. Those neurotransmitters are not only made in your brain, but believe it or not, depending on which one we're talking about, 50 to 90% of those neurotransmitters are actually developed in your gut. And so there is a strong connection with our gut and with our brain. What we eat, how we feel, how we react, how we're able to function is connected through that pathway. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So what the brain needs to grow and develop, really stimulation. So when you think about brain development, I want you to think about children that may be in situations where they're in orphanages. Maybe they're in a foster care home that may not be as supportive as it should be. Perhaps they spend a lot of time as an infant on their back in isolation, not a whole lot of stimulation. And will their brain develop a sensory system? And the answer to that is yes, it will develop. However, it will develop based upon what's in that context, what's in that environment. So we need to stimulate in a healthy manner. Adopting a child from a different country, parents sometimes find, and this is more anecdotal from my experience, parents may find that child may not have a strong connection to them hugging them, holding them, showing compassion towards them, because perhaps they spent a large time frame of their life lying, in isolation, as I mentioned before. So sensory stimulating environments, targeting as many systems as possible will allow us to really wire those brainstem structures I mentioned, to wire that front part of the brain to the rest of the body more efficiently by stimulating the body through sensory stimulation. So I wanted to highlight just a few of this other senses you may or may not be familiar with. We don't have time to go into all of them today, but again, we don't just have 5. To the left, you'll have what we call more of our traditional senses, our far senses, we call them, but we have senses that are more near to our body. So these near senses are involved in movement and balance, such as vestibular, knowing where your body is in space, such as proprioception, interoception, understanding that input to your internal organs, so responding to hunger, thirst, having to go to the bathroom. Praxis, having an idea, planning it out, and executing it, and it's really a strong motoric connection to praxis. Paretic, that's your sense for itch. And then lastly, thermal, which is obviously temperature. And so all of these things, and there's more, we just won't get into all of those today. We have to be able to integrate together to then produce a response. When we are talking about self-regulation, before we even get to what activities would work for our children or adults, or ourselves, if you will, we need to first identify thresholds. So threshold means how much information really can we take in before we have a reaction. There's different types of thresholds, so I'm just going to kind of summarize it for us. So before I have a reaction, let's just say to movement. If I'm sitting in a car, and if I am reading something, such as a book, my threshold is actually pretty low to that movement sensation. I have what we call motion sickness in that moment, so I have a low threshold for that. However, some people have a very high threshold. They love roller coasters. Motion sickness is not an issue for them. So we first need to identify what is the threshold. Is it a low threshold, or is there a high threshold? Now, sometimes that's not an easy question. You may assume one thing when it's the other. That's why it's so important to gather information from how does this individual react in different environments? Can I have reports not only from a parent, but a teacher, coworker, et cetera, to gather as much data as possible. So the reason why I need that is because maybe I'm assuming that this person has a high threshold, like they like a lot of intensity, they like a lot of movement, but maybe they're utilizing that system so that they can avoid other things. Maybe they have a low threshold for the sound of a teacher's voice. Maybe they have a low threshold for being near other people. So when someone comes too closely to them, they push them away. And so I just want you to kind of think about that. And you can think about it as a whole because there's usually a theme, but there's also variation if we're talking about movement, sight, sound, smell, etc. So it could be that you have a high threshold for one sense and a low threshold in another. But in general, what is the big picture for that child? And we have a little exercise in a bit that we're going to challenge you to think about that. Then lastly here, what's the arousal? So if I have a low threshold, let's say I really have issues with certain smells. Okay, this is kind of true for me. If I really have issues with smells, that means my threshold is going to be pretty low. In order for me to not be exposed to that unwanted stimuli, my arousal level may be pretty high, right? So I may have a high arousal level and a low threshold. And the reason why my arousal level may be high, and that's the behavior you get to see. Maybe I have to leave the environment. Maybe I cover my face. Maybe I say things that's inappropriate. That arousal level that's high is really my sympathetic nervous system. And you may be familiar with that, with the phrase fight, flight, or even fight, flight, freeze. A lot of the reactions we see in our individuals that have ADHD is really a reaction of that sympathetic nervous system. It's very protective in nature. I want to leave an unwanted environment. I want to block out an unwanted stimuli. So I may push things away. I may, be somewhat aggressive, if you will, based upon that arousal level. So I need to understand that to understand if I have someone that has this threshold, I'm going to go back to the previous slide, a threshold that's really low, I need to be careful about the activities that I'm giving them. I need to make the environment somewhat quiet because their ears are going to be heightened. If you're in a fight flight state, your pupils are dilated. So the lighting could be too intense for someone that has a low threshold. I need to set up the environment that's going to be supportive for them. Now, if I have someone that has a high threshold where it takes a lot for their body to react to the stimuli, that means whatever I'm giving them needs to be really intense, strong enough and long enough. So suggesting something for a week or two may not be enough. Maybe we need to try something over a longer period of time. Maybe I need to do more than one activity simultaneously for that individual, for that child. For instance, not just swinging on a swing, but listening to rhythmic music while swinging, doing something with their hands while swinging. And I'll get into some of those activities before we end. So I'm going to go to our first video here, and I want you to think about looking at this video. Think about this child's threshold, perhaps. Think about their arousal level. It's not perfect because it's a snapshot. You don't know him. You don't know the background, but it's just for us to kind of get our minds going for a bit. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for us. Oh, if you can consider this child enjoying that movement, perhaps they have this high arousal, perhaps they have a high threshold where they just want more for their body. And so what you're going to see is what we may call hyperactivity. Imagine him in the classroom having to sit and attend for a longer period of time. What that may look like. And so I'm going to have to address his needs before having him do some functional activities. Maybe before we sit down to do homework, we have to do some wall push-ups. We can do maybe rhythmic games, yoga, etc., before we sit down to attend to a task. And so that's just one example. I do want to move forward to our next slide, and I'll give you some more hints and pointers. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the vagus nerve. So I did mention that there is a connection between your mind and your body. This nerve exits your brain, and it's the only nerve that travels from the brain through the rest of your body. We call it the wandering nerve. It will tap into not that fight-flight system necessarily. It has connections to that too, but the reason why we're talking about it is it's going to tap into the parasympathetic nervous system for calming, organizing, to help us to be able to respond more so than react. And so that vagus nerve is going to be really important for us to target our self-regulation. All these things that I'm going to suggest may look like activities, for instance, preparatory activities, if you will, or exercises. But I want you to kind of redefine what meditation is, redefine what mindfulness is. It's just being in the moment, non-judgmentally. In the moment could be coloring, right? In the moment could be taking care of a plant. And so there's different ways of presenting this. Sometimes for our younger children, saying we're going to sit and do a meditative session may not be feasible. So here are some other things that we can consider. One thing is a Valsalva maneuver. Which is tapping into your vagus nerve. You may be familiar with the Valsalva as bearing down. So when you're on an airplane, you have to pop your ears, for example. Instead of, as an adult, we can easily do that ourselves. You know, we can hold our nose and fill our mouths with air. That is going to decrease your heart rate. It's going to trigger this parasympathetic response. Meaning, this is really good if you have someone that is suffering from anxiety disorder, and children that may be anxious, or you see them constantly in that fight flight. This may be complicated for them to do, but I'll show you an image at the end, which I call the trumpet, where you have the child actually blow their trumpet, which is their thumb, and they put their mouth around their thumb and fill their cheeks with air, and that will do a natural Valsalva maneuver for them. Another way is targeting the eyes, so having gentle pressure on the eyes, and I'll show you a mind fold in just a bit. Massaging the outside of the ear. Vagus nerve is attached to the outside of your ear as well, and that will target it. Vagus nerve is activated through spinning. Cold temperatures, and the diving reflex, which I'm not going to have time to go into today, as well as massaging and pressure to the back of the neck. Anything having to do with the back of the throat, because that's also a connection to your vagus nerve. So gargling or singing or meditating and doing that vibration will actually help to target that nerve. So there aren't any rules, right? So I'm going to show you what I would call a mindful meditative session with our little boy we saw that was bouncing on a ball. And so we didn't call this a mindful session. We didn't call it meditation, but I want you just to see him playing with this bucket. This, what we're going to see is actually him playing in a bucket of ice. It has ice, water Orbeez in it. He's doing a little matching game alongside of that. And so I'm going to let you just take a couple of seconds to watch him and look at how his arousal level has changed. And you could imagine this is ice cold water. But for a child that has a high threshold, again, that's why it's important to learn about their threshold. And high threshold, he is actually responding in a way that perhaps we would with a nice warm bath, because it's meeting his needs. Again, this is somewhat of a meditative session for him without saying that it's meditating. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and move on. So again, there aren't any rules. There are a lot of things that we can do in order to introduce meditation to the body. I'm not going to go through all of these reflexes for you. They're there for you to review. I do want to highlight, though, and there's an article in our references for you to look at if you're interested in these primitive reflexes and a connection to ADHD. I do want to just give you kind of a synopsis on this. I'm going to go to the next slide. All of these reflexes happen early on in life. Some happen as in utero and as the baby is being born. These are reflexes in the body that help the baby get through the birth canal. Some of these reflexes help the baby learn how to crawl, how to reach for things, how to grasp for things. And as you see on this list, most of them should be no longer visible after a certain time frame, such as a year, 12 months, 6 months of life. We shouldn't see these reflexes being triggered as much as often. If we see the reflexes being overutilized later on in life, especially if we're talking about an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 13-year-old, perhaps it could be affecting their function and their attention. Just to give you a couple of examples, there's one that when the baby reaches for an object, they will turn their head towards that object and then the other arm will come up. Call it a fencing pose. You may see a child sitting at the desk like that often, holding their head up and then writing with the other hand. their lower body is curled up in their seat. Some of these things that we think are a lack of attention, if you will, could be related to the reflexes. When you put a rattle or something, or even put your finger in a baby's palm, they will grasp around it. We call it a palmar reflex. The next thing they'll do is bring it towards their mouth. And so if this is still evident later on, you may see a child cutting, or even an adult, if you will. I've seen this later on in our adolescents and adults as well. Cutting or coloring, and their mouth is constantly moving, their tongue is sticking out of their mouth, or they're chewing constantly on their t-shirts. That could be an indication of this palmar reflex. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just wanted to highlight how many are there and how many we may need to look for. That could mean you seek out someone like myself, an occupational therapist, or seek out a physical therapist. So I'm going to show you a basic assessment and some of the things that we may see if these primitive reflexes are evident. As this child is having their head turned left and right, we are trying to see if he maintains his arms being straight. If not, we may see that ATNR. Can he, maneuver his body without the facial expressions, the mouth moving around, without tremors and his extension in his hands? So I'm going to just give you a quick view of what that may look like. Oh, sorry. Okay. So again, we're seeing if he can maintain his position. We're looking at the mouth. This is our same child that was on the ball. And we're seeing him collapsing into his side. And I'm going to just let you see one more. I want you to look at his face and his arms and how he's reacting to these poses. And we see some slight tremors there. Okay. So again, that could be, extensive. It takes a while to really get a true assessment, but I wanted to give you a little snapshot. Now, if we notice these things, or even if we suspect it, what are some basic activities you can do with them, some programs, if you will. These are a couple of programs. The one to the left with the little girl making the circles, that's called Me Moves, MEMOVES. And if you look up Me Moves, you will be able to find some of their online videos as examples. Wonderful program. I think it's very mindful and meditative. There's a nice rhythmic metronome sound music that goes along with it. Brain Gym, they've been around for quite a while, as well as Ballovisics. So BALAVIX, I believe, Ballovisics, and that's the last picture up there in the right-hand corner. So my book, as Susan mentioned in the beginning of our webinar, I have a book titled Self-Regulation and Mindfulness. So I do encourage you to take a look at that, especially with whole body mindful activities that you can work on that we don't have time to go over today. I have 9 different targeted areas that I target to address the whole body. One of my favorite, I will have to say, is utilizing a metronome. If you're not familiar with a metronome, think about someone learning how to play the piano, and it helps to keep you your rhythm and your timing. We now have electronic versions where you can get free ones on your phone. I do like the old-fashioned one, but if I'm traveling, I do like to use the one that's on my phones, especially in the airport, so I'm not getting stopped by security. However, that and the metronomes are great with tapping into our self-regulation, our arousal. And the reason why is that we have these, what we call brain oscillations, and basically brain waves. And so our brain waves really respond to rhythm. And so we are influenced by our environment, as I mentioned before. So if I hear an erratic sound, then my brain waves may be a little erratic. I'm not exactly sure where it's coming from, what to attend to. But if I hear something that's predictive and rhythmic, my brain waves actually get a nice pattern. What happens is I have a release of endorphins, so I feel good. I may have a release of what we call serotonin, so I have a sense of well-being. I'm able to then focus and then attend. And so we see, even in a session, a child that may be somewhat hyperactive, their movements are erratic. If we turn on a metronome based upon whatever their threshold and arousal is, we may need to slow them down, or we may need to speed them up, we actually see them improve on their response rates versus reactions in that session. Here are some other quick tips. If you're not familiar, to the top left corner there, that's a glitter jar. Our younger kids, even my adolescents, we've worked with like making those glitter jars. Very, very mindful. You can even display to them how their mind may feel when they have too much information going on, how erratic it may be, and how if you just sit still, you will see the glitter fall and calm. So it's a nice visual representation. If a child is in fight flight and they're having that sympathetic nervous system reaction, they're constantly seeking out input or running away from things, their body may be overheated as well. So a personal fan or a personal ice pack are things that I recommend, especially for, you may see our young boys or even girls that have ADHD. They're constantly sweating and their hair is sticking to their forehead, especially after physical activity. So having a personal fan or, again, the ice pack, or even a water bottle that has ice in it or that's been half frozen, it's like a slushie, could really tap into their nervous system to help them to regulate a little better. You see the mindfold at the bottom. We have a connection again with our eyes and with our heart rate. So oculocardiac reaction. So having that, the mindful can not only block out stimuli for a period of time, but it also can tap into your nervous system. At the top in the middle, we have a labyrinth. This is a classroom setting where the teacher has taped the floor in a labyrinth or a maze, if you will. And the children will walk through the maze. And that is a form of meditation and being mindful in the moment. In the middle, there's a mandala or mandala. People pronounce it differently. And that can be used for coloring. The reason why I love them is it's all age ranges. Something very simple, not as complicated as the one you see there, could be used with young children with crayons. A more complicated version could be with adults with colored pencils. We even use straws to blow paint to make different mandala patterns on paper. Adding respiration is always a great way to tap into your vagus nerve, parasympathetic nervous system, helps you to focus and attend. Drumming activities are just beautiful. I can't talk about drumming enough. Actually knowing drumming or listening to drumming music, especially having it in the background during a classroom activity or a mindful break. Using some of our whistles and kazoos, as you see in your top right-hand corner, another great way even to tap into a Valsalva, as I mentioned before. Chewing gum, if it's appropriate. Chewing gum is very rhythmic. That nice rhythm will help you to calm and to regulate. Just the same, at the bottom right corner here, we have weighted medicine balls. And so adding weight, heavy items will actually help you to focus and attend a little better as well. I added in my book a recipe, I call it for the SAM box. Okay, so the SAM box is for self-regulation and mindfulness. So all those objects, maybe not the huge medicine ball, but a lot of those objects I just presented to you can be inside of this box. On top of the box, we can decorate it however we want, but on the top there needs to be some sort of dial. I like to say that that dial represents a radio dial. So if you're really, really loud, it's turned up. And if you're really, really, quiet, it's more towards the bottom. Somewhere in the middle is where we typically need to be for learning. And so I use it to learn from the child or adolescent. How are you feeling today? Would you say that you're feeling loud or quiet, somewhere in the middle? And they're able to tell me even without using words. And been pretty successful with that. And it is a spin-off of the alert program, if you're familiar with that program. And inside of the box would be things that if they feel really loud, maybe they need to open up their box and maybe we need to do some respiratory blowing activities. Maybe we have a pinwheel inside so they can do something to get their arousal down from being so loud. These are some other exercises that I may put inside my box. Pretzel squeezes that target the external ear. They're squeezing the ear. And that, again, that's tapping into vagus nerve. Number 2 is blowing the trumpet. I mentioned to you before a way of getting a child to do a Valsalva maneuver. Number 3 is hibernate. Sometimes we just need a moment to hibernate. So having a child in a position where they're holding their knees, they can be sitting on the floor with their head between their knees or even in a chair if it's not possible to sit on the floor. If you're an adult, you may need to do this by simply lying your head down on your desk at work for a little bit with the lights down. So that's hibernating. And then lastly, an eyelid massage. Again, connection between your eyes and your heart and your arousal. So taking 2 to 3 fingers and really, putting gentle pressure on your eyelid, doing circles in one direction and then circles in the opposite direction. Lastly, inversion. So upside down. You may remember being a child and going upside down on your couches and being at the playground going upside down. This actually stimulates your lymphatic system. It decreases that fight-flight reaction. It activates the vagus nerve. It could help you with sleep. So they've actually kind of relaunched the marketing of those inversion tables that we were used to seeing in the 80s. So if you lie down on an inversion table, it flips you upside down. Great way of getting stimulation if you're an adult or an older child. With our younger children, we do things like headstands on a wall or yoga. Simply doing yoga positions will help with that. Upside down on a couch, or simply placing school items underneath the chair of their desk. So they have to go down, for instance, maybe a shoebox, and they have to go down to their shoebox to be able to retrieve their writing utensils, etc. So periodically, they're getting that stimulation of being inverted and then sitting back up. And so all these things are ways to tap into your nervous system pretty simply. I am giving you my references here. Again, the Self-Regulation and Mindfulness is my book. There's also an article on primitive reflexes because I know that's a popular topic that we didn't have time to go into today. And I do want to thank you all, and I'm open to questions.
Oh, thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Gibbs, I'm just looking at the questions. Many of the parents involved are wondering when and how to integrate some of these techniques. So one example would be a teenager, or a number of parents have teenagers who are show extreme anxiety around school or exams. Are there any techniques that you recommend for young adults or teenagers, high school students to calm themselves during studying or stressful tests?
So working with master students, and I'm in a different role now. I was a chair of a program where I worked with adult learners, and so they're getting their master's degree. So quite a few, had what we would call accommodations where, they had a diagnosis and they had to take their exams in different locations and work on their anxiety. So I often recommend it to them. Number one, and this is kind of off topic, but number one is make sure that they have the accommodations that are rightfully theirs, within that setting. All the way through graduate school, you have the right to take a test or exam outside of the classroom if you need to. But in terms of the self-regulation activities, I often tell them to tap into as many of their sensory systems prior to arriving for the exam. That means the night before is going to be really key. And so having a routine is going to be important. And within that routine, really identifying what is self-soothing to the body. What is it going to, what's the best way to calm the body? So some of these strategies we talked about should happen the night prior, even days prior, as we have our adolescents get more into final exams and things like that. They're really prepping well in advance. So really trying to have a schedule, if you will, of when we're going to do these activities even before we get there. I often too will recommend asking simply, are they allowed to chew gum? Making sure that that's possible for them. Can they have ice cold water at their desk? Because we know that naturally calms the nervous system. So just getting those permissions from the teacher as well. But I often would tell my students, be careful of what you do before you step into exams. Many of them would have conversations with their peers that would just cause their anxiety to go even higher. So I would tell them, bring your headphones, sit in a corner somewhere and stay to yourself. Don't look at your study materials prior to. Just be in that moment with whatever you're listening to on your headphones and stay in isolation. So those are just some of the quick strategies.
Okay, those are great ideas. Thank you. We do have a number of teachers. And so here's one question from a teacher, and there are a number of others. If you have a class of a number of children who appear to have ADHD symptoms, kindergarten, first grade level, how would you start the day? Are there any particular activities that would help them become calm and focused? as they set out upon the day?
Yeah. So especially for that age range, the first thing to do is look at your environment. Oftentimes they are walking into a classroom that is super bright with fluorescent lights. They have a lot of sound going on from their peers and people walking in the hallway. And so you want to do your best to really dampen that, if you will. I enjoy having, lamps in the classroom, lamps, even in my office, I have a desk lamp, because I want to, not be completely over aroused throughout my day. So having different lighting options, one basic one that I love the most is natural light. And that means to open up the blinds and turn the light off. So if you can, I've recommended this to classrooms before, have them walk into a nice soothing environment. Perhaps you have some gentle water sounds in the background of waves crashing. Lights are a little bit lower than usual, and you have a nice routine that's set in place. If you can, respiratory activities, anything that has to do with blowing and deep breath. For little guys, it could be that they have nice pinwheels, those old-fashioned pinwheels we used to love when we were younger, and they're blowing the pinwheels and watching it go around. You can even have straws and have them have cotton balls where they're blowing it across the table, or even feathers that they're blowing up in the air. So anything having to do with breath is another way to do that. But you may want to start them off with, like I said, setting up the environment, and then also allowing them to have their nice cold water bottles. Everyone takes a chance to perhaps have a cool drink, and then we'll get started with our activities.
Okay, that's great. I guess this is not surprising. There are a number of questions of parents of middle school kids, 8, 9, 10, kids are very resistant, either to the idea of mindfulness or to standing out in any way. So here's one. My son's very self-conscious. He doesn't want to bring fidgets or other techniques to school where he really needs them because he doesn't want to stand out. Another one is, how can I get my child to buy into this idea of mindfulness? I know it helps him, but he's very resistant. So there's maybe two different questions, but on the topic of helping your child buy into activities.
Okay. So I have a 9-year-old boy that is my son, and he's considered gifted. So we have our moments of poor emotional regulation, et cetera. So some of the things that I would recommend, for instance, if you're thinking about the classroom setting, instead of a fidget, you may want to make adaptations where it's not as visible. So underneath the desk, of course, you have to work with the teacher with this, but underneath the desk, having Velcro and different fabric that may be underneath there that he can fidget with. My kids, and yeah, I do have mine on. My kids and I, we wear bracelets, right? So different crystals and things, it could be for different reasons, but in general, my daughter likes wearing it so she can do this, so she can fidget. Right? It's a natural fidget. My son has that, or sometimes he'll have a little stone in his pocket that he can twirl around. No one needs to see that the stone is in his pocket, or it could be a coin. So it's a way to kind of hide it, but it's still giving them what they need. Also letting them know, yeah, we all do this. I'll give you an example. My straw with my cup. I like to have a straw. That's really my way of, kind of feeding my sensory needs. And so it's not something that's abnormal. Everyone has a thing, right? So really trying to make that key for them. And then secondly, as you saw in our activity with the bucket and the ice, he thought that was a cool thing. Like he's putting his hand in something cold. It was kind of funny. It was a nice game that was attached to it. We didn't say, hey, we're going to do mindfulness here, but we know in that moment that's mindful. And the last thing would be, how can we incorporate the rest of the classroom? Those Me Moves programs and things that I showed you, I've recommended for the entire classroom before. And really, I may have been there as a consultant for one child, but everyone needs a movement break. And so during that time frame, all the kids are doing their activity. The teacher may have to help the child, that I'm servicing a little bit more, but they're all getting their needs met. They're all doing a mindful activity, even though we may be focusing on that one child. Can we make even crafts? I've gone into my son's classroom and we've all done a craft activity. We've made brain caps because I taught them about their brain. They did coloring. So what can you do that would perhaps be still child friendly for any child? You don't have to highlight that one child that has the needs because of ADHD.
Okay, that's great. Question about kids who are having a sort of a meltdown, in the middle of a meltdown or a violent reaction, or I'm not sure what tantrum.
Mm-hmm.
What is the best course of action for a parent?
Mm-hmm. It's challenging. I mean, I think we've all been there, or we've all witnessed, tantrums, and that can be very challenging. One of the first steps, and it's probably the more challenging step, would be something, in my book, I coined the term reciprocal regulation. And what I mean by that is, just like when you're on an airplane and they tell you have to give the child the oxygen mask, give yourself the oxygen mask and then the child, so that you don't pass out while you're trying to help the child. The same thing goes here. So automatically your heart rate goes up. Your sympathetic nervous system kicks in because of what's going on with the child. And so your arousal level, your regulation is now dysregulated. So the first thing is really trying to calm yourself, taking some of these strategies that I've given you to do for yourself, not just in that moment, but practicing them, making it a practice. Just like I said, I practice meditation, I practice yoga, so that you're working on your own arousal level. So in that moment, if you approached a child with, tense muscles, if you approach them with heavy breathing and your heart rate is panting, that reciprocal regulation is actually what we call, you're activating your mirror neurons. So the person you're interacting with will respond in the way that you're reacting. It becomes a vicious cycle. So I actually, in the moment of working with children that have severe tantrums, I will take a huge exhalation where they're actually hearing me exhale, and I'm actually bringing my regulation down, will be the first step. The next one is, once they're there, we're talking about a reaction, not a response. And so you trying to verbally rationalize this with them is probably not going to be key. It's not going to be effective. So you want to make sure that the environment is safe, that the child is safe, they're not hurting themselves, but decrease the amount of talk that you have. The more words that come at them, the higher their arousal will be, the worse it will be. So the best thing you can do is to try to stay calm in your body, decrease your verbalizations, and if possible, give them deep pressure, a whole body, big bear hug from the back if you can. If not, just simply make sure that they are safe, and try your best to not give it too much attention, because feeding into it will also become a learned behavior.
That's so interesting that the person who asked the question says that telling him to take a deep breath or calm down seems to make it worse. Mm-hmm. So that confirms, that's the sort of confirmation of what you're saying about using fewer words.
Yes. Yeah. And if you can sit behind them, if possible, as a therapist, I had that opportunity. They could feel me taking my deep breath. So I kind of did it for them until they got in tune with my breathing.
Okay. Oh boy, so many questions. Any suggestions for oral behaviors due to anxiety? Nail biting, chewing, pulling on chewing on pens, hair, those kinds of activities.
Yeah,
where something is always in the mouth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, that kind of goes back to those primitive reflexes we talked about, perhaps not being integrated. So some exercises that address whole body primitive reflexes to start, but to directly target the mouth and the mouthing of objects, you can start with having a vibrating toothbrush. And so, in the mornings when they're brushing their teeth, to have vibration in their mouth, on their lips. If they're younger, I may use it throughout the day, or recommend to the teachers to allow them to have that vibration in their mouth throughout the day. There's different devices you can use that may be a little more efficient, that a speech therapist can help you with. But in general, vibrating toothbrush could be something that's helpful. Also, there are various programs that if you're working with a therapist, they may want to do a Beckman protocol, which is stimulation to the mouth. However, it's usually a need to do intense flavors. So crunchy or spicy flavors for the mouth, those children typically like that. So even spicy potato chips may be something that that they may like, believe it or not, or even having Sour Patch Kids, those types of candy. So you're trying to stimulate the mouth as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
I often recommend too to explore, is it the mouth, putting things in the mouth, or is it the rhythm of chewing that the child is enjoying? So could you replace it with fruit leather or chewing gum, something to that effect?
Okay.
And I should add that they do make jewelry that you can chew on. It's called jewelry. Some people don't like it because of the saliva that goes along with it, but I often say, which one would you rather have? You have to pick your battles, right?
Okay. Yep. Lots of kids with ADHD have real sleep disorders and difficulty falling asleep. Do you have any mindfulness recommendations related to the nighttime hours?
Yeah. So for one, we as parents need to know when the child is actually tired. When is their body actually getting ready for rest? So it may not be 7 o'clock that you think. It may not be 8 o'clock. It may not be 9 o'clock, even though you desire for them to go to sleep. So if you try to put them to bed before they have a significant, what we call melatonin release, that's going to help their body get ready for rest, then the body's going to react in just the opposite of what you desire. So for one, finding what is their true bedtime, and that may be a bedtime challenge over a weekend, kind of just giving them the freedom. That doesn't mean watching TV, doesn't mean playing, so make sure the environment is set up nice and calm as much as you can, but allowing them maybe to still have conversation, to still draw or color, and then see what time that they're actually getting sleepy. And then we turn off the lights and tell them it's time for rest. So really finding what is that bedtime. And then also using things that will help the body, such as a sleeping bag that may be a little heavier, give them deep pressure to their body, to help them for calming. You may want to have metronome sounds or chimes in the background playing. If they participate in deep breathing activities with you, that's wonderful. If you can't get them to do that, just setting up the environment in that way to support their body getting ready for rest.
Okay. Sort of classic sleep techniques for pre-sleep time. Sounds, yeah. Here's a teacher who just offers the fact that taking a 1-minute brain gym break, having the whole class stretch, seems to help her struggling students. It seems that she's offering
very
that.
good.
Yeah, great idea.
The whole class, absolutely.
The whole class, right. On the subject of a calm classroom, what about a calm setting for the home when kids arrive home from school? Any suggestions or any thoughts on ways parents can create a calm and environment for their children?
Yeah. I would say, I'm a parent and I get screen time it is what it is. We try our best, right? So I'm not going to judge parents on screen time, but of course that's the first thing you can target is not jumping right onto laptop, computer, etc. But even if we have television going, or we have laptops going, headphones, we make sure that we are adjusting those settings. And there's ways to do that even on your television. There's different programs that will allow you to set up the volume. Also to set up the lighting that's on the electronics so that it's not giving off too much blue light, too much stimulatory light. So that's electronics, but also just the volume of the home. As much as you can, decrease it. Just like I talked about preparing the classroom for all the children to enter. What is your child walking into? And I will tell you, it's nothing like, even as an adult, think about walking into your home. You had a long day and you come home and there's chaos going on. Your arousal level just goes up automatically, and then you immediately want to then retreat and do something else. So really trying your best to have a calming environment. Maybe you do have some soothing sounds on. Maybe you turn the lights off and you have the windows open, preparing for them to come. And a nice beanbag chair in the corner of the room would be ideal.
Okay. Let's see. This is a question related to mindfulness strategies elementary students could use in the classroom without drawing attention to themselves. I think you've addressed some of those ideas. Do you recommend apps or tools for teaching mindfulness to children? Are there any that you found specific, to be helpful?
I say you have to use whatever tool you're comfortable with, and some people would gravitate more to an app because it's just kind of concrete, right? You don't have to do a whole lot of preparation, so I'm fine with that. The Me Moves, they actually have apps and things that you can use, so I think that's just a wonderful one, to look into. And there are a lot of apps that are out there, but I think we don't want to overuse it because then it kind of indicates what we're talking about with too much visual stimulation with the screens. It could actually go the opposite. So using it periodically if you have to, but even using it to train yourself to come up with other activities that you can do. As much hands-on as possible would be great. Doing arts and crafts is actually a mindful activity.
Requires focus and being still, right? This has been a great presentation. I can't thank you enough. There are so many wonderful techniques, and everyone, don't be sure to check out Dr. Briggs's book. Let me just bring that slide up again. Where is that book? Okay, Self-Regulation and Mindfulness, 82 Exercises and Worksheets for Sensory Processing Disorder, ADHD, and Autism Spectrum Disorder, published in 2017. Is that available on Amazon, I'm thinking?
It is on Amazon, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. I recommend that to all of you. And I want to tell you that next week on Tuesday, we have Eileen Costello, MD, and Perry Klass, MD, two very well-known doctors talking about managing anxiety in children and adolescents with ADHD and learning disabilities. That's Tuesday, the 16th at 1 p.m. So we hope to see you back. And thanks to everyone for joining us today. Don't forget that at attitudemag.com/webinars, you can find replays of all the webinars, weekly webinars, a real library there now on Attitude Magazine, as well as podcast versions on iTunes, Stitcher, and on our website if you like to listen in the car while you're walking. So lots of resources there. Thank you, everyone, and hope you're having a great summer. Thanks again so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.